It's always difficult to speak about Bahram Beyzaie in front of his families. So this is the first time and very different, but I will do my best. All right. So the reason why I started researching Bahram Beyzaie goes back to my teenage years when I was probably about 13 or 14, just right after the revolution. A friend of mine, five or six friends of mine, and I decided to create a library. This was just 2 years after the revolution, and everybody was excited about doing cultural activities, positive ones. So we made a library of putting our books together, a lot of them, and then cousins, uncles, and everybody else also gave us some books. And all together, we came to about 600 books and set up the library in a garage in the neighborhood. But after maybe 1.5 years, we realized that things are getting heated and we are going to get into trouble if we continue running the library. So we decided to dismantle it. And among the extra books that each of us received, I had 2 plays. One of them was Death of Yazgird, and the other one was Honeymoon by Ghulam Hussein Saadi. Both of them really amazing. And I got confused by these 2 plays. And then and there, I became interested in plays. So you know that anybody who remembered the early years of the revolution knows that teenagers between the age of 14 and 17 were really driven to know what is going on around them. So we read novels, but plays for the first time. I became familiar. And then I was confused by Bahram Beyzaie's Death of Yazgird. It had said it all in about 70 pages. And then you had to read and reread it again to understand what was happening in the play. And a lot happened in the play. I'm sure that those who have read it or have seen the film know what I'm talking about. So I became interested. Later, I realized that I had seen, the famous Amu Sibilu, Uncle Mustache, in Kanun. And I just followed his work. Whatever was published later, I became interested and continued until I did my PhD on Bahram Beyzaie and Wali Shuinka, realizing that he was much better, in the process. So in any case, later I continued my work, and until now I have done a lot, and I'm just closing my research. Another monograph is coming out probably in a year or a year and a half, and then, but still there are a lot to say about Bahram Beyzaie, a lot. And whenever I talk about Bahram Beyzaie, the first thing I came to was the understanding of the type of creativity was really different from other ones. Creativity is always overrated. We are never original. Originality is not possible. We always borrow ideas and put our own experience in something to create something new. And Bahram Beyzaie is an expert on that. Whatever he has done has something special in it. Yes, some of the works may not be as great as Death of Yazgird, but at least 20, 25 of his works are amazing. And I'm talking about global level. Even when I teach them in comparative literature courses, people get confused about how great this work is and how concise in some places it has expressed the things. I have taught Afra, I have taught the 1001st Night, and also Death of Yazgird. And also his films, of course. Not just Bashu. Bashu is the easy one, everybody loves it, but other films as well, like, for instance, Downpour. The example of the creativity that I give about Bahram Beyzaie goes back to what I call epistemic privilege. This is a confusing term. It has been used by Marx. It has been used by sociologists. But I will give you a very simple example for you to realize what happens. If I want to open that door, that is the only time I move a lot, sorry. I will go to this door. I press the handle and go out. Because human mind is practical minded, we are always concerned about what I'm going to do afterward when I leave that door, when I leave this room. But what happens if the handle doesn't do what it is supposed to do? When it doesn't open, when the door doesn't open, that is the moment that you pay attention to the handle, not before that. Nobody pays attention to the handle. Handle is not important. But when you pay attention to the handle, you realize something is wrong. The door doesn't open for me. You look at the frame, you look at the structure, maybe the building is collapsing that the door doesn't open. So the realization that something is wrong only comes to you if the door does not open for you. If it opens, you don't pay attention. So that is why we always ignore the privileges that we have. And those privileges give us the opportunity. Everybody says, I have work hard to achieve what I have done. Obviously, I have worked hard, but there are many people who work hard and cannot do what they can do because the doors did not open for them. And this is exactly what happens to a type of creativity that I'm talking about. But this type of creativity is not born until the person overcomes the anger, overcomes the pressures that that person has suffered. It means that if you become angry, you never achieve epistemic privilege. You never become capable of seeing. It remains a minority perspective that suffers and becomes angry rather than creates new things, rather than establishing a dialogue with the center to change it and make it better. So this type of creativity needs epistemic privilege, a kind of seeing that other people don't see, and it needs experience of exposing yourself to other cultures to realize, is what is happening to me right now also something that happens in other cultures? And the moment that you want to do that, you go and read Shakespeare, you go and read other great writers to realize the lived experience of different generations in different countries and understand how it works. Bahram Beyzaie was crazy about cinema from a very early age. How? Because he wanted to escape the crazy school teachers or the classmates who just marginalized him because of his background. And that didn't make sense to him. So he went to cinema, but when he came out of the cinema, gradually between the age of maybe 12 and 18, he brought out details that nobody else had paid attention. So if you listen to people talking about his early years, he said that he was so perceptive about details of what was happening in cinema. And that gradually built him up, making him what he became. So this type of creativity needs epistemic privilege, which comes from the minority background. Examples: Marx, Freud, Foucault. Go around, you can find all of them. We don't need to be a minority to suffer these consequences. All of us may have those kinds of experiences. But origin of this kind of creativity has a lot to do with trauma. And that trauma has been cured and sublimated, has become something greater because that person wants to establish a dialogue with the center to show what is wrong with my culture. And it also needs the experience of feeling that I'm central to this culture, even if these people don't know it, okay? And this is exactly what has happened in Bahram Beyzaie's works. Again and again, in all his works, he goes for dialogue. And this is very important because we are talking about 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Iran, when the revolutionary zeal had made many people crazy, all right? But in Bahram Beyzaie's case, dialogue is central to whatever he has done. So today, what I want to do is to focus on a very simple folk story that Bahram Beyzaie heard as a child, all right? His grandmother told him that story, but it became the center of a kind of thinking for Bahram Beyzaie that later evolved into what we see as the image of women in Bahram Beyzaie. It is unique, remember that? This is even before the second period of feminism in the West. He started in his plays, and it evolved to become unique in Iran until the 1990s. So it is only towards the end of the 1980s that we see people paying attention to the position of women in Iranian cinema. Before that, only maybe one or two people had done something similar. But Beyzaie is the special one. So it is the tale that I want to tell you is Mehrin Negar and the Snake King. You may have heard it in Samad Behrangi's story as 7 pairs of iron shoes and 7 staffs. It is similar, but the names are only different. But this is the original tale that we heard as children. And then I trace the impact of this story and what Beyzaie did with that story on the later works by Beyzaie. Okay? So before getting to the Snake King, I just want to tell you about his puppet plays. One of the qualities of Bahram Beyzaie was that from the beginning, he studied Iranian marginalized dramatic forms. So from the beginning, again, not only he paid attention to marginalized people, but also he paid attention to marginalized forms and marginalized narratives and tried to bring them out to undermine the dominant discourses that were exclusionist. This term, exclusionist, is what I have created for what we call totalitarian views that want to omit everybody to achieve power for themselves. At the expense of destroying others, want to achieve power. So the first play that he writes is called Arash. Remember that Arash was a marginalized hero. He didn't appear in the Shahnameh. Until the 19th century, when some writers paid attention, I mean, mostly Iranologists paid attention to Arash, not many people knew about this story. They had seen maybe Abu Rayhan Biruni's summary of about maybe half a page. They had seen later Yarshater wrote again a half a page about what happened in the story of Arash. But that story became essential to Beyzaie because a poet, Siyavush Kasrai, composed a poem. That poem was a great one. But Beyzaie realized that something is wrong with this. And what was wrong was that the hero always had conflict with people. So why is it that in this story, suddenly people decide to have a hero and the hero is born? And so he had a problem with that. And in Arash, he pays attention to how a marginalized person becomes a hero because in his journey of recognition, right? So this was the first one. In the first maybe 4 or 5 plays, what we see is the reformulation of the ideals of heroism in Bahram Beyzaie. The puppet plays, Arash, and the Pahlavan Akbar are the greatest examples of what I'm telling you. In Arash, he pays attention to the mythical hero. In puppet plays, he pays attention to the folk heroes. And in Pahlavan Akbar, he pays attention to the Zulkhane heroes. And why does he do that? Because this is a period in which Iranian cinema is obsessed with tough guys of the street, which Bahram Beyzaie knew they are just stupid thugs rather than being the good guys that are depicted in Iranian cinema. So he goes to these heroes. Nobody talks about it, but we should know that Pahlavan Akbar is the first hero in Iranian theater who dies, who doesn't get the girl, all right? What happens is that 4 years later, we have Qaisar. Everybody talks about a new type of hero who dies towards the end. Of course, Qaisar cannot be like Pahlavan Akbar because Pahlavan Akbar was closer to Takhti, who had a similar fate, all right? So what we have here is 3 pictures. And in these 3 pictures, he questions and changes the meaning of heroism. And he shows that the hero is as much of a victim as a div is, as a demon is. One of them, the forces of nature or the forces of society pushes him toward trying to achieve recognition by doing things for people again and again. And the other one gets so upset that becomes angry and just tries to destroy. And sometimes they don't even destroy, they are just demonized without doing anything. Again, this is what we see in his early plays. But what is, again, special about this play, this is the puppet plays. So we have a puppeteer, narrator, and who represent the dominant discourse that has been on for thousands of years. We need heroes and we need demons. But what happens is that the Pahlavan of the story, the hero, doesn't want to kill the demon. He goes to the green pond and he realizes that the green pond, which everybody talks about, is actually the result of the tears of the demons and his ancestors. It has been the product of these people. So the discourse of demonization is something that Bahram Beyzaie focuses on here. And the Pahlavan decides not to kill the demon because he realizes that he is just somebody like him, somebody who has suffered to come to this point. So the Pahlavan doesn't want to kill the demon. The Morshed or the puppeteer gets upset, and then he kills the Pahlavan, destroys the Pahlavan. And when the demon wants to tell everybody that the Pahlavan actually was killed by this puppeteer, he kills the demon too, all right? So this is one of the first plays in which the demon and the Pahlavan are compared. Somebody told me that, are you saying that the Bahram Beyzaie is looking at himself as a demon? I said, no. He's looking at himself as the demon, as the hero, and as each of us, the black and the girl. Because each of us are placed in a position in which we have to decide how we are supposed to act against this dominant discourse. So what happens in the play is that originally they act like puppets. But when they decide to think for themselves, when the Pahlavan says that I don't want to do what I have been doing for thousands of years, I don't want to kill the demon, he becomes like a human just before dying. And then what happens is that the girl in the story decides that I have always been either a damsel in distress or a beautiful object of desire who has been chased by the hero. But I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be something different. I want to be myself, okay? And in the process, the black also comes to a similar decision. The black says, I have either been a jester or a demon because of demonization process. So I don't want to be any of them. I want to be a hero. What Beyzaie does, this is interesting. So he's creating citizens out of these puppets. He says they make mistakes. That's the point. In their decision, they decide to revive the Pahlavan, but they know that if they revive the Pahlavan, the demon will be born. Not the real demon, it's not the real demon, but the demonization process will be born again because the society needs a Pahlavan and a hero. This is a very important play, these three plays together. Remember, Shrek was made 30, 40 years later. We are talking about a time nobody talked about these things. There were some people conscious of this demonization process, but few people had written so beautifully and so simply about it to communicate with people. The play was played successfully. But this is the point in which we see a woman, all right? This is the beginning of a new image of a woman as a thinker. So women in society had been active for at least 45, 50 years before that. But few people had paid attention to that role. They had kept repeating those previous discourses of damsel in distress. So Beyzaie does that. Why does he do that? So I have pointed out some of the things that I have here. For instance, let me see if it works, all right? So general focus on limitations imposed on the marginalized. This is what happens in all Beyzaie's works. So remember, he's not, one of the things about the activities that we talk about, the rise of marginalized discourses in the last maybe 40 years, is that some of them are not aware of the other groups. For instance, if it is a feminist, they may become blind to the sufferings of the racial minorities, all right? But in Bahram Beyzaie's case, is that he is aware. He pays attention to everybody, to the types of marginalization that we have in society. So then we have his mother and grandmother, folk tales of survival. Remember that the only narratives in which women had a big hand were folk tales. Epic stories were told by poets for the kings or for the heroes. But folk tales always have female figures going around doing quests and achieving great things. So those folk tales are important. Then we have family values and older sister. Bahram Beyzaie has never been religious, but he comes from a Baha'i background. And there, women and men are considered to be equal. And that is important. Because from somebody who grows up with the family, he knows that that is a good discourse. All right? So then we have a quest. Sorry, I just jumped. All right. He had two daughters in a society in which all the cultural products were obsessed with men. So what is the place of these two daughters in society? So it makes you more conscious of the situation. And also at the same time, he knew the failures of the culture of toxic masculinity, which was central at the time. Toxic masculinity, even the term speaks, but I'm going to get into details of how toxic masculinity works for all of us. Remember that men suffer as much from toxic masculinity as women do. It's not something that women only suffer from. So what is the story of the Mehrin Nagar and the Snake King? The story itself has high potential. So what happens in the story? Usually in such stories, we have a woman who has to marry a snake. Why? Because of family problems or to save her family. And then in the process later, after marriage, she realizes that this is a handsome man. He's not actually the demon that he looks to be. And then he decides to burn the mask. Symbolically, it tells you everything. It tells you that the mask of toxic masculinity has to be destroyed so that the man of fertility, the man who can protect and help and work for the family, be born. The man who loves women rather than just wants to downgrade them. So she does that, but there is a charm, and the man disappears. So the Snake King disappears, goes to the land of demons, and she has to embark on a quest to bring him back. So this is the story of a questing woman. One of few folk tales in which women are central. In Iranian culture, we have several of them, okay? And many of them, interestingly, circle around the figure of a snake. So I don't want to get into details, but it tells you a lot. Because remember, in Mesopotamian culture and Iranian culture, snakes have two sides. And one side is virility and fertility and productivity, the power to go through the earth and change it and maybe plow it for fertility. But that snake can also bite and kill. So the only thing is to use the power of the snake for fertility. And we will get to more details about that aspect. what happens is that she goes to the land of demons, and she manages, with the help of the Snake King and nature, to save the Snake King. The demonic in-laws chase them, but they manage to escape. Okay? And this is the story. It has correspondences with many folktales around the world. One of them is the story ATU 425. And we always have, these are called snake spouse stories. Either the girl kills the snake, or the girl manages to reform the snake. And remember that in the story of the 1001, the framing story, we have Shahrazad. What does she do? She civilizes the Dragon King. She is the Dragon King because the term Dragon King refers to somebody who hoards women and who hoards treasures of the land and does not allow fertility. So he does not give the money to the people, and he does not allow women to fulfill their roles in society. Okay? So this Dragon King is civilized in the story of 1001 Night, or as Bahram Beyzaie has said several times, we have the opposite story of the Zahak. So the two women prepare the situation so that the demon can be killed. All right? So the one story that almost many people who are interested in literature know in the West is the story of Psyche and Cupid. All right? Psyche is a very beautiful girl and wise, and Cupid is the son of Aphrodite. Remember that the term divinity, divinity, they have the origins in the European cultures. So many of the deos, or the gods of the ancient Greece, are the ones that are similar to the divs of the ancient Iranian religion, which later they turned them into demons. Okay? So here, the divs that we have in the story are actually like Aphrodite. If you study the story of Aphrodite, you see that many of the things that she does are actually demonic, all right? And she destroys. So in the story, what Psyche does is that Psyche marries this figure whom she's not allowed to see. And she is told that he looks like a winged snake, or this is exact definition, the definition that is given about him. But she decides to see him. She goes and sees him, and he disappears. And he is banished to the land of Aphrodite. She is supposed to go and bring him back, and she does that. Exactly like the story of the Snake King, with some minor varieties, because Greek stories have been recorded with more details, because they were written much earlier. So there are stories similar to that. So let us see then what happens in this. We have women agency. And the women agency is the one that burns the mask of toxic masculinity in order for the man to be born, to become what he can do. And we also have the quest for saving the land, because the beloved, the Snake King, is also a man of fertility. But what does Beyzaie do with this? Beyzaie extracts a revolutionary discourse out of this folktale. What happens here is that at the center of this, we have the ideals of leadership and citizenship. The Snake King wears the mask because he knows that everybody is ready to grab the power out of him and kill him. So from the early stage, this Snake King becomes a symbol of a person who has to hide his actual self in order to protect himself and perhaps the land. So Negar is the one who destroys the mask, and she has to go and find the Snake King. But what happens here is that instead of the demonic in-laws chasing them, we have the army of the usurpers chasing the demons. So what the Snake King and Negar do is that they revolutionize, or they just give knowledge to the demons to make them aware of their situation. So they make them aware of the process of demonization so that they can rebel against the usurpers. And they do that. So what we have here is the story of a king trying to make his people, especially downtrodden people, citizens. This is exactly happens. And from my perspective, this has a dialogue with what we call the White Revolution of the 1960s. Because the White Revolution released a lot of forces, a lot of positive forces, but it failed to fulfill its political emancipatory potential. And this is, I think, it is as if Beyzaie is telling the king, okay, you did that. now it is time to go towards the political reforms. Why? Because towards the end of this play, after, for instance, destroying the army of the usurpers and everything, he just relinquishes power. He decides to give power to the people. And this is exactly, it happens in two of Beyzaie's plays, and one of them is here. The other one is Pardeh Nei, or the reed curtain, okay, all right. So looking back at this play, which was written in 1966, and it was performed 1967 and 8, what we can see is that it talks about women, the quest of a woman, and it talks about the quest of a man, royal man, but the two together make the future. But and at the same time, what they do is that they are not power grabbing. They are not going after power. They just want to bring democracy rather than destroy everything and get the power. So what does Beyzaie do with these two? We usually have two major archetypal patterns. One of them is the story of the quest of extraction. Quest of extraction usually in the Iranian culture happens to a Mitraic hero, like Rostam, goes and bring Bijan from the land of Turans. Like Esfandiar going to bring his two sisters from the land of Turan. We have similar ones. We have the story of, for instance, Perseus. Perseus going to bring the head of the dragon. So they go and bring something, or they go and save a friend, all of them, right? And the famous one that everybody has seen is from Breaking Bad. Walter White going to the den of the dragon to save Jesse. That is a famous one that we have seen recently. So it is not something that has disappeared. It gets repeated and repeated. It's a recurrent pattern, all right? So the other one is the quest of the civilizing or controlling the dragon. Usually that is associated with men of science or men of knowledge. In the Iranian tradition, always it is the wazir. The good wazir who controlled the Arabs, who controlled the Turkic invasions, who controlled the Mongolians and made them better. Historically speaking, we know that many of them committed bad things in the process of doing that. Nizam al-Mulk, for instance, if you study Siyasatnameh, you figure out he did so many things. He killed so many people in order to establish the stability that is so much appreciated by many people during the Seljuk period, all right? So, but the myth is there. The myth of the civilizing Iranian wazir or Iranian intellectual who reforms the invader and turns them into kings of prosperity. And historically speaking, it makes sense. Anybody who wants to have his dynasty continue has to just negotiate things with the locals, especially the local intellectuals or local leaders, in order to find a way to see how they can run the country. But women are neglected here. Remember that in many situations, women married the invader. And it is their son who becomes the patrons of art, patrons of whatever. So what happens? Is it just the wazirs doing that, or the women are also doing something? We neglect that, okay? So Beyzaie uses the quest of extraction for how the story that we just heard, the story of the Mehrin Negar. But the story of Mehrin Negar echoes aspects of previous stories. One of them is the story of Ishtar. Ishtar, remember, Ishtar is not a Mesopotamian god. She is also an Iranian god, because many of her qualities can be seen in Anahita, right? And her name was actually Inanna Ishtar. And Inanna is Nana. Nane is also equal to Anahita. So we never know what the origin was. It is very confusing, but it's very possible that some of the qualities Anahita, the Indo-European god, which was called something else, Sarvarati, I think, mixed up with the stories of Ishtar. So Ishtar is the god of fertility, love, and wisdom, and also for protecting this war and violence in some cases. So she is a contradictory figure. But in one of the stories, in one of the narratives, when she goes to the underworld to do something, she's entrapped, and she promises to bring back somebody. And because she is angry at her lover, Dumuzi, she sends him instead to the underworld. But later she changes her mind, because this Dumuzi symbolizes summer. So she makes an agreement, she brings Dumuzi out 6 months a year, and 6 months a year she goes back. So he becomes the embodiment of the dying fertility god, the one who has to die to be reborn. That we also see something like that in Gharibo Meh in Beyzaie, all right? The story of Gharibo Meh is a stranger and the fog, okay? So So we have this story, which is at the center of some of the things that Beyzaie does, like Tārā. But there are also other stories. When you hear the story of Arash, have you heard anything about Esfandarmaz doing something? Few people have done that. But if you go back to the original story, what you hear is this. We have Iranians being under siege. They have no way, and the king of Turan gives them the leeway of shooting an arrow to determine the borders of Iran. Okay? But then a woman shows up. Right? That woman is Esfandarmaz, the goddess of fertility, earth, protection, and family. And what she does is that she is the one teaching Arash and Manucher how to build, how to create, how to make this arrow and bow. So, and in Zoroastrian myth, we have this story. We say Esfandarmaz was betrothed to Frasiab, which is the demon of drought. So it was as if she was married to somebody else, or she was supposed to marry to somebody else. But she chose her beloved people and her beloved husband. So she is the one choosing. Therefore, she decides to help Arash and Manucher to determine the borders of Iran and bring the land from Amul to Amudarya, to the Iranian lands. Okay? I have an article about that. It's a big article, so I don't want to get into details. But what happens here is that the woman chooses her beloved, okay? Chooses whom to marry. And we have also the celebration of what we call Mard Giran, in which women were allowed to choose their husband, okay? So why did I mention that? I will tell you when I will get to Tārā. Because in Tārā, we have a heroine who is supposed to choose between 4 men and decide which of them really is the champion of fertility for her. Okay, so what is the place of Anahita here? Remember that Anahita was also is significant as the one who brings victory to Iranian kings and Iranian heroes. And in many stories, we hear the story of sacrificing horses or sacrificing cows to Anahita in order to bring victory, similar to some of the stories that we hear about Ishtar. So the idea of bringing victory is also central to Anahita, the one who gives victory by choosing. So here we have this is the scene of investiture scene of Khosrow II received the rings of power from Mithra. Some people say that is Ahura Mazda. I think it is Mithra, and Anahita in Tārā. All right? And down the picture at the bottom here, we have Tārā. All right? And it is the horse of a historical man bowing to Tārā as if it is bowing to a goddess. All right? In Bahram Beyzaie, women are not goddesses, women are women. But he normally mythologizes humanity and demythologizes the gods. So the gods and divine figures become human, and we see their humanity. But the qualities that we usually associate with gods and goddesses are given to human beings, so that we know that these are actually human qualities. So what do we have in Chirikei Tārā? A Chirikei is usually a love story. All right, a love story, an epic-like or romance love story. We have many of them in the Iranian tradition. Most of the Kurdish ones have not been, or recently been committed to paper. Like, for instance, I have mentioned one, Mem and Zin, or Khoj and Siaman. But Bijan and Manijeh is a very good example. Who has read the story? It's a ballad, all right? It's a Chirikei. But they always have Chirikei, for instance, Mem and Khojan, Bijan and Manijeh. But here we have a Chirikei in which there is only the name of a woman, Chirikei Tārā. And we remember that when we talk about tragedy, when we talk about great stories, usually the name of the main character is at the center, Hamlet, King Lear. The person who is at the center is very important. So tragedies were usually called after the person. Comedies, no, but tragedies always. So here, we know that this is about Tārā. So this is, of course, in Kalagh or the Crow, we have something similar, but Tārā is the most significant place. It's the closure of everything Beyzaie has done for women, because Tārā is the ultimate figure. Okay, so let's see. Of course, it continues, but I'm saying that it was completed with Tārā, and then after that, we had other examples similar. We have the sword here as a magic lamp. So Tārā returns home from Yeylaq, from her mountain house. And there she realizes that the grandfather is dead, and she has inherited a sword. Nobody wants the sword. So she gives everything to other people, but nobody wants the sword. And then when she is going to the sea, suddenly a figure crosses the road, sorry. So the road, this figure has arrows in the back, covered in blood, and he is dressed in figures of somebody maybe from the medieval period. And gradually they come into dialogue. So a man from the imaginal, a man from the past has come to reclaim his sword, saying that all my tribes were killed, only this sword has remained, and I've come here to reclaim my sword. Well, what does it tell you? It tells you about a marginalized history, a history of a people who were killed. But remember that at the center of the story of Tārā is brother killing. Because what has happened in this play is that Tārā's husband was killed by his own brother. And this historical man is coming here to tell humanity, or to tell Tārā, the story of how brother killing has destroyed Iranian culture. Excuse has always been, for instance, religion, has been, for instance, an earlier victimization or whatever, but it has always been brother killing. And Tārā is supposed to choose between different discourses that she is exposed to. In her dialogue with the historical man, she learns a lot about the history of her land and what has happened to her people. So she becomes like an Iran, but an Iran which has a choice. Remember that when we talk about women being depicted as ideals or as nations, there is always a man involved who is in quest to change the nation or saves the nation, all right? But in Bahram Beyzaie, even when we have a symbolic aspect given to a woman, that woman is the one choosing and changing everybody around her, rather than being looked for, or rather than being saved from something. And this is exactly what happens here. So ultimately, she wants to save the historical man by dying. But in the process, she says, just stay here, I will go and give my children to Qilich, one of her suitors, and come back. And that is the moment when the historical man realizes that, because he's a man of honor, right? He realizes that the greatest honor is a kind of sacrificial love that Qilich has for Tārā. Therefore, he just leaves. He decides and he goes back to the unknown. So we also have this usually a template in literature, honor and love conflicting with each other. But the historical man realizes that the most honorable act is an act of love. And this is exactly what happens here in this play. So Tārā is the one choosing and changing the people around her. Why is this important? The figure of imaginal in Iranian religion and also secular culture is of great significance. This figure of imaginal usually appears to a person. We have the stories of, for instance, Sohrawardi, and enlightens the person, gives the person knowledge about the past and future and what is going to happen. But here, this figure has appeared, and he learns more from Tārā than Tārā learns from him. So in a way, it is as if Beyzaie is saying, okay, this figure of imaginal is the person who was crazy about falling in love, fulfilling the dreams of fertility, and having a normal life. So our history is overridden with death, violence, and inherited brother killing. This is what we have to transcend, okay? But again, it is important that the figure of imaginal is not just religious. Remember, in the religious side, we have Mahdi being somewhere between death and life and coming in future, but in the secular one, which was once religious, we have the story of Kaykhosro coming back, right? Kaykhosro and Sushian coming back. So, but in the, for instance, performances that we have in Tazi or Naqadi, Beyzaie has reported this too. In many cases, for instance, people jumped in to stop the Naqal, the storyteller, telling him, please don't kill Sohrab. Don't let Rostam kill Sohrab. So why that tells you about embodiment, as if they are watching the actuality of a situation happening. So the figures of imaginal are not just religious. The figures of imaginal are also present in all great literary works, because we look up to them and we try to learn from them. The story of Rostam and Sohrab is ever living. The story of Zal and Sam is ever living. The story of Zal tells you about celebration of difference. This boy with white hair is cast into nature. But when he is raised by Seymour, He comes back, becomes the greatest lover of the Shahnameh, one of the greatest heroes of the Shahnameh, the father of the greatest hero of the Shahnameh, and the wisest man in the Shahnameh, right? Which is, we know that, all right? And everybody who has read Shahnameh knows the place of Zal. Why? He's a man in between two worlds. He is a man who is raised by an embodiment of wisdom, which is Simurgh. And remember, Simurgh is a female figure. I always compare her with a Na'i in Bashu, the Little Stranger. Because what happens in that story happens exactly to Bashu and Na'i. So, what did Beyzaie do with this? If you go to his films, because I think you have seen films more than the plays, you see the figure being repeated. So, the first one is not that direct. We have in Ragbar, Atife, who is a dressmaker, okay? She works hard. But remember that everybody says, Hekmati is the intellectual coming and realizing that he cannot change the culture. Actually, he's just a bookish, stupid man at the beginning. He doesn't know what he's doing. But when he comes there, gradually by encountering Atife's seriousness and hard work and character, and by looking at the children who have to work so hard, he finds himself. He realizes that he has to do something for these people, and then becomes the intellectual, constructive intellectual that Beyzaie introduces into Iranian cinema. So it is actually the woman and the children saving Hekmati, not Hekmati saving them. Of course, ultimately, he cannot save himself or anybody else. But that is the process. So a bookish man being changed by a woman. In a way, he's saved. So, Qaribaume, something similar happens. We have the figure, the central figure is like Esfandarmaz, all right? She embodies fertility. But what happens is that she tries to save the Qariba Ayat from death. Ayat doesn't remember where he has come from. He comes from a violent background, violent unknown. She tries to reclaim him from that violent unknown, but the forces of the unknown attack him. He destroys them. But ultimately, he decides that I have to go to see what is wrong in this story. And interesting that many people don't notice, one of the reasons why he goes back is that the boy is killed. There is this marginalized, disabled child that he tries to help. Again, one of the things about Beyzaie is that he also paid attention to disabled children. Not many people did that in Iranian cinema. Beyzaie did. Both in Ragbar, one of the central figures is a disabled child. If you think about it, he is the one hailing Hekmati in front of everybody when they want to attribute what has been done to the theater to the headmaster, okay? So that child is significant. And he is the one, in order to save the child, he goes to the unknown, so she cannot save him. So that is one of the stories. But she does try to save him. So in Kalaq, what is supposed to be saved? Let me see. Okay. All right. In Kalaq, what is supposed to be saved is a lost identity. The lost identity of the mother, all right, who represents an earlier self of Asiya. But Asiya is just like a woodpecker. She is not like a crow. She is a woodpecker who picks in order to find the truth. And ultimately, not her husband who embodies borrowed modernity, but it is her who embodies real modernity that ultimately finds the truth and realizes that the mother is the owner of the photograph. So the lost identity is reclaimed. So I don't want to get into details because there are so many things to say about the crow. But again, in Marg Yazgird, Death of Yazgird, we have two women. So these two women, just like Shahrzad and Dinazad, who transformed the Dragon King, they transformed the three representatives of power in Iran. So these are the downtrodden, and we have three participating audiences. One of them is a priest, the other one is a commander, which is a prince, and the other one is an officer. So these three are transformed by the narratives of the ger and the mother, who simultaneously also show their own conflict. So the play can be seen psychologically or socially or politically and historically at the same time. But what happens is that the two women change the decree of the powerful men. And in Bashu, there are several famous scenes in which Nai saves Bashu. And the most famous one is when Bashu escapes into the heart of darkness, into the jungle, and Nai goes and grabs him and brings him back to her home. All right? And we have that significant scene in which she suddenly changes her discourse and talks as if she is a goddess. She says, "Barkhiz sar jayat bekhos," the famous one. Okay? In Killing Mad Dogs, Mojde is sitting here, we have the exact story. But what happens is that she goes and reclaims the husband, saves the husband, but towards the end she realized that the husband himself was the criminal. So that tells you a lot about a culture who has come to a new realization about what is wrong with this culture, all right? A culture of deception. But what she does is that she transforms herself by deciding to write about it. So the saving comes through creativity, all right? And we also have the 1001st Night. So it is repeated. So it's a pattern which is repeated. I think Beyzaie has talked about some of those things himself, because it is people have asked him, and sometimes he has come to the realization that such patterns are repeated later after making the films. But this was my talk. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I sometimes talk very quickly and may miss some of the things that I have put there. So if you have any questions about those, ask me, please.
What are the pieces that you missed?
Sorry? Yeah, but
now tell us the pieces that you missed.
I don't remember. I think, did I talk about 1001 Night, the framing story? No. All right. So Beyzaie makes this distinction, saying that in epic, men are important, definitely, because they are the national heroes going around killing and destroying the enemy and stuff like that. So the heroes of protecting the land. But in folktales is the place in which women's agency become clear. In 1001 Night, what we have is that we have Shahrzad and Dinazad, all right? So Shahrzad is the storyteller. Not many people pay attention to the role that Dinazad plays there, all right? Dinazad acts as the listener. So you here sitting and listening are as important as Shahrzad telling the story, right? And this discourse between the two gradually reforms the man. So she tells the story, the man hears the Dragon King, and gradually becomes the man of fertility, the man of prosperity. There was a feminist, and I was talking to her about, feminists are really good, but some of them are radical. So I will tell you what, all right? So in one of her things, she said, if I were Shahrzad, I would immediately kill the king. I said, all right, that makes sense. But that is inherited violence. It is the continuity of violence. What she does is that to reform this man, she has been able to save a group of men, or maybe create a new discourse. That is the purpose of 1001, to create a new discourse about the relationship between men and women. And remember that in many of the stories, for instance, what we have is that in Beyzaie's work, often it is not the beauty of the woman and her ability to create a situation that changes the individual. It is her agency. A good example that he has learned from is the story of Enkidu and the sacred prostitute who goes and civilizes him. Do you know that story? So Enkidu, long story, in Gilgamesh, in the myth of Gilgamesh, we have Gilgamesh going around doing whatever he likes. Raping women, raping boys, whatever. So he's mad, and his power is so much that nobody can do anything. So they decide to control him by finding somebody who matches his power, and they hear about this Enkidu, this animal man who lives among the cattle, and he's very, very wild and powerful. But nobody has been able to capture him to civilize him. And they send a prostitute, and the prostitute goes there, sacred prostitute, and this term is a bit problematic. We will see, because she is wiser than anybody else, apparently. So what she does is that she goes there, and it's not just her beauty, it's her power of teaching him manners and turning him into a human being. So the civilizing power of a woman is embodied in the figure in that story. And Beyzaie has learned from it. The civilizing power of the woman in Ayyar-Name, one of the important, Ayyar Tanha. In Ayyar Tanha, we have the story of a woman who civilizes a crazy man, all right? This crazy man because of the violence that he has suffered because of the Mongolian invasion, has gone mad and goes around. He rapes the girl and also kills her father. But she doesn't let go. So she follows him and turns him into a proper hero. So this not because of her beauty, but because of her power and knowledge. So this role of the civilizing woman is very significant in Beyzaie's work. All right. Even we see it in the story of Ragbar. All right. When they engage in discourse, he realizes that life is not what he has always imagined it to be. He realizes that life has aspects that he has to find a role for himself and become the man that he's supposed to be. So in the story of Mr. Hikmati. So this civilizing role happened also in Pardeh Nei, or the reed panel, all right? We see the woman changing men into something that better to be able to fulfill their responsibilities in societies. So I think that was the 1001 Night. But what Beyzaie does is that he says that probably in the story of Zahak and the two sisters of Jamshid, or two daughters of Jamshid, we have had something similar, but it has been brushed away to hail the power of the two wise men, Irmail and Germail, right? Beyzaie says probably they had as much of a role in saving the young men that Zahak killed as the Irmail and Germail had. So in a way, he's saying that these stories originate from the same discourse, the discourse of transforming or destroying the Snake King. Right? In one of them, in Zahak, they cannot transform him, so they prepare the path in order for the army of the youth who are safe to come back and destroy Zahak. In the other one, they transform the king. Beyzaie also thinks that this is the function of performance. This is the function of storytelling and literature in general. The function of literature is to enlighten, all right, and to prepare the path for reform and emancipation. And if it fails to do so, it entertains the tyrant so that people get ready to destroy, in a way, so that it can buy more people to the army of the emancipation. Okay. Did I answer the question? All right, go on, please. Yes. Yeah.
I'm just interested in knowing what encounters or conversations did you have with Bahram Beyzaie himself? How much of these ideas came from those conversations?
There are points. So let me just tell you something. Bahram Beyzaie is very special. I will tell you why. So what happens in literature is that many people get confused by the idea of intentional fallacy. Often the intention of the author is not important. Why? Because the author is usually like a catalyst between the culture and what he or she produces. And in the process, he or she may produce things that she has not thought about. But because of taste, because of the codes of culture that he or she puts in that work, they evolve gradually. So half of the meaning of a literary work is usually produced by the people who read it and discuss it and get inspired by it. All right? But in the case of Bahram Beyzaie, I can say that 80% of whatever is there, he has either identified from the beginning or has later come to the realization, okay, this may mean that too. So this may mean that too does not mean that the author from the beginning knew, and that actually doesn't need to know, all right? Because a creative process always happens because the culture, you have a dialogue with culture. That is why I put the name of this, the Iranian culture in Bahram Beyzaie's works. It doesn't mean that whatever I have said in this book comes from Beyzaie, but many of them have evolved because of my dialogue with Beyzaie's works. And I'm sure he knows much more than I do about Iranian culture. And if people who know him will tell you that. So I've had conversations with him, mostly through Mrs. Shamsai here. Maybe 4 or 5 times we have talked about aspects of his works. But he has a lot of interviews. And if you go to those interviews, in between the lines, you can discover a lot. Right? So I have used those, but most of my work has been focused on analyzing the films or the plays, because there are a lot of things in those plays that I think not many people have noticed. The example that I gave you was the example of in Bashud, The Little Stranger. We have this hawk, we have this hunting bird going around, and Nai talks to the hunting bird, right? But when you look at the story of, I don't know whether Bahram Beyzaie knew or not when he was doing it, but now it just becomes like Simurgh, all right? Because Simurgh saves Zal from destruction, and Nai saves Bashu, the black boy from the south, from being marginalized and probably even being killed. We don't know what would have happened to Bashu if Nai had not been there, all right? So we have the discourse of Simurgh and Zal at the center of this film, whether Bahram Beyzaie was conscious of it or not. Because when we produce, they are in the back of the mind, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. But I think he knew, all right? He may tell you no, all right, but probably he knew, all right? Because his knowledge of myth is huge, all right? I remember once I talked to Bahar. What was the name of Bahar? Mehrdad Bahar. And he said that after me, or me, equal to me is Bahram Beyzaie. Although he doesn't write as much about mythology. Mehrdad Bahar was the most well-known writers about Iranian mythology in Iran. And Bahar believed in him. He said that he's one of the best here. And it is important to be able to use it creatively rather than just write about it. And this is what Beyzaie does. Okay. Yes?
Thank you for a great presentation. I have actually two questions, but try to be brief. So one, the first part is that I didn't see Tarabname. Is it because the genre is shifting that you didn't kind of...
So Tarabname is a more recent. Yeah. So what I did was that I went through the earliest stages of the development of the female figure in Bahram Beyzaie's works. So what happened in the mid-1970s was that we see حقایقی truth about Layla دختر Idris, we see the crow, and then we see Tārā. And these three close the image that he wants to produce, and later, of course, that figure is reproduced in different forms. But the woman as the savior or as the civilizer are at the center of many of these works. I haven't seen Tarabname, okay? So I don't know what happens in Tarabname, but I am sure if you look around, you will find something similar about that, okay?
The second part is about the theme of woman, a figure of woman as a savior, that I have a little bit of conflict feeling about it. I think we talked about that, like actually giving a woman agency, right? But the way I see it is that this figure of a woman, like a human woman, right, it's becoming so idealized that connect to this figure of God, sort of goddessly type of a person that actually is removed from the modern idea of that, okay, a woman also is as equal as a man, can have demons, can, make mistakes, can be human, and don't need to be in service of taming a man or saving a man or something like that. So that was the kind of thing that I just, I don't know, is that the theme that you are trying to get out? Because I didn't read all of these, sort of like the script or kind of like the play itself. So, or is it something that really he wants to achieve, to mythologize this?
No, let me just explain this way. Bahram Beyzaie from the beginning questioned the idea of hero worship. So for him, what is important is that we should all be citizens. We should all try to figure out what we need in this society and try to contribute to it. This is clear. And that is why his early plays are focused on the ideals of heroism and who is a hero and whether it is possible to be a hero in this modern society or not. And we see that Pahlavan Akbar dies. But Pahlavan Akbar is upset about the whole situation of serving a people who do not want to help themselves. And the other heroes are also like that, okay? So that aside, this is about men. But when we talk about women, women also make mistakes. In many of his films, we see women who do bad things as much as, but the main figure, for instance, is important not because she is a hero or a goddess. She is a person who makes proper choices. So in my writing, I always highlight that she's not a hero, she's a citizen. She's a citizen. So once I wrote a citizen, Shahrband in Persian, somebody said she is from village. No, but actually she is the ideal citizen. So he doesn't create a hero or a heroine. He creates an ideal citizen. So if you want to have role models, usually you create a figure who has some of the best qualities that you find in a woman or a man, all right? So I don't think he idealizes that figure. Nai is just a village woman, and we see that. Or Tārā has the moments of weakness, has the moments in which she doesn't know what to do. She's just like any woman, but she makes good choices in the process. What happens is that she's not a heroine. She is a citizen. So I don't think idealization happens at that level. And that is why I say demythologizing. So the figure of, for instance, Esfandarmaz or Anahita that we see in these figures doesn't mean that they are goddesses. They may make mistakes in the process, all right? Like in Sakoshi, or she makes a mistake by being tricked by her husband. A goddess is not tricked by a man, but she is tricked by the husband. So that means in the process she discovers something. So at one level, she is a woman. At another level, she is the people of a culture coming to themselves, figuring out what is happening around them, and then making decisions to become citizens, to become worthy of being modern in a society which is crushing them and trying to change it. So that doesn't mean idealization. To me, it means that the consciousness that the women of this culture can play a significant role in their own emancipation, and also the emancipation of men around them is significant. And then there is nothing wrong with men trying to save themselves and women trying to save themselves and men. There is nothing wrong with that. Chivalry is not wrong. Chivalry becomes wrong when it becomes a means of power. And a woman can be as chivalrous as any man can be. So if you go back, you will see that there have been many women who have done chivalrous acts.
The presentation maybe should be a little bit more relational, not just like, I understand the purpose of the paper is to focus on the figure of women, but instead of like showing it as just really a woman, but how this growth is both way, kind of like more.
I do understand what you're saying. The reason why I made this presentation like this is that now that you're sitting here, this is 2024, but when Beyzaie started, this was 1960s.
Yeah, you're right.
All right.
The context is absolutely.
Nobody wrote like that. Nobody talked about women. Remember that the first films that we see in which women become gradually, for instance, Darush Meherjoui, for instance, it happened later, much, much later. Many of the female filmmakers who did a great job, by the way, they started working towards the end of 1980s. We had Bita, for instance, but Bita was not really such a great figure. It's more of a victim. So the question is, from a feminist perspective, are we talking about survival? Are we talking about victimization? You know that these discourses of feminism are important. And the center is paying attention to means of survival is more important. Not to create heroines, but to say how we can survive and overcome the traps of patriarchy, right? So that is why, for instance, I create this PowerPoint in that way, to show the journey that was completed in 1979, much before the other people became conscious. Remember, the revolution made many people very conscious about what was happening. Prior to that, we had women trying to change society, managing, contributing during the Pahlavi period, and the Pahlavi were more responsive, much more responsive in comparison to the post-revolutionary era. But when the revolution happened, many religious women became politically conscious, okay? Then the universities were Islamized. Religious families did not send their children to universities, but after the revolution, they did, okay? So they went there and they came out semi-secular, not completely. Some of them religious, even we have the discourse of feminist, Islamist feminism. I don't know, Khadija, they talked about Zainab and Khadija. And then the discourse was powerful. It contributed, some people changed. That is why we had, for instance, Paris, for instance, by Meherjoui, or that is why we had Layla, which is an adaptation, not Layla, sorry, Tārā, which is an adaptation of Ibsen's A Doll's House. This is a very important period. Women coming out of the universities and then wanting jobs. Where is my place in this Islamist society of yours? I should have a place. And they claimed that place. Whether secular or religious, they wanted to have more rights in society. So when you talk about Zan Zendegi Azadi, women life freedom, remember that this discourse is 150 years old, all right? And people have contributed to it, all right? There was Barahani writing Tarikh Muzakkar in the 1970s, for instance. Beyzaie from the beginning, when he was, even if you go to Mirzade Ishqi, you find that he was conscious of what is the name? This kafan siyah. So conscious of what is wrong with this culture and what we should do. Maybe in a distorted way, because they were just beginning a discourse, but it was real. They were conscious. And now, from the 1990s onward, we have the women movement becoming very, very active in Iran and producing the results that we see. In the process, they have made many mistakes, as we all make mistakes. So that is why the presentation is like that. I'm not saying, so he's creating role models that he believes are missing in Iranian culture. And I think he does a good job, right? So it's more of a citizen rather than a heroine or a hero. Thank you very much. Yes?
Quick question. A follow-up question, does the finale, the ending of Sarkozy fits into the framework that you just described as a civilized, wise woman trying to transform, or it's a pure anger and revenge? Or maybe it's a recommendation that maybe you're so much betrayed by year 2000 that forget about transformation, just go after revenge.
In Sarkozy, so let me just repeat the first part of the question because
Does this fit the framework?
Okay. So in the story of Ishtar, okay, when Ishtar comes out of the underworld, she finds Dumuzi enjoying life with some women. Right? And then she decides to just let him go. She did, of course, she punishes him, but in killing Rabbit Dog, she doesn't do that. So she says no to inherited violence in order to create for herself. Remember, she doesn't do anything. She doesn't kill the husband. She just leaves them to themselves to go and destroy each other, all right? But what she does is that she wants to write about it, probably the story of Sarkozy. So creativity is what replaces this inherited violence that is that. But that anger can be seen in the later film. That anger happens when you're all sleeping, وقتی همه خوابیم, all right? In وقتی همه خوابیم, nobody can be saved. And the woman herself becomes a sacrificial figure because she's fed up with the whole thing that is happening. So they try to save the film, all right? So the act of saving happens both to the woman who wants to maybe reunite with the husband, and she's upset that she has fallen in love with this new guy, all right? And also, the act of saving happens to the film. They want to save the film, and they cannot because of this culture. Many of the things that Beyzaie says in that film, many people became conscious later. At the time, people got upset. He's angry, he's talking about, yes, he's angry. Maybe we expected him to do something, but that is your expectation, not the work of a man who started working in 1958. Before the revolution, in the course of 7 years, he made 6 films. But after the revolution, in the course of 40 years, he made 7 films. It tells you something. Why? Why? Remember, so I'm not, for instance, criticizing Mercury or any of those guys, but Tārā and Beyzaie couldn't really make films after the revolution, especially Beyzaie. And they were great directors. Beyzaie, one of the greatest, okay? So in the play, I can say he's the greatest playwright Iran has seen. In cinema, he's one of the great 2 or 3. We don't have so why only 4, why only 7 films? So that was why he was angry. But even I question the fact that it is out of anger. Maybe it is also giving a warning to what was happening around him. All right. So you can read it differently. But I can see when people say that he is angry. All right.
Thank you so much. You are so knowledgeable, and I am very ignorant. But you raised some question for me, and I would like to ask you to, as Carl Sagan say, that a good speaker is the one that like talking with the kindergarten child. Please explain for me, as I am a big fat kindergarten 5 years old, the 1001st night, because I don't know so much about Bahram Beyzaie, but I become curious because I realized that it's not 1001 night, it's 1001st night.
Okay, so
what is that?
The 1001 Night is a collection of stories with a framing story in which Shahrazad saves the king and saves the land, okay? So she's a trickster, and she's also a sacrificial figure because she volunteers to go there, all right? But she's a trickster because she tricks the king by telling the stories, okay? The 1001 night, the 1001st night tells the story from another perspective. So it's a play in 3 parts by Bahram Beyzaie. In the first part, what he does is that he compares the story of Shahriyar and, what was her name? I forgot. And wait. So we have the story of Zahak and Shahnaz and Arnavaz there. Zahak is the dragon king. Shahnaz and Arnavaz are the daughters or the sisters of Jamshid. But he cannot become the king without marrying them. So they are the embodiments of earth and water, but an earth and water which has agency. It means it also includes the people who decides who is the king and who is not the king, right? Earth and water in Iranian history has always been significant. The Achaemenid kings always, whenever they conquered a place, they asked for water and earth. And water and earth symbolizes complete submission. So Zahak cannot become the king without marrying the daughters of the Jamshid but these daughters represent the people of the land. They have to accept him, right? So what happens in the story of Zahak in the epic is that they are not given any agency. The people who saves the land from Zahak are Ermail and Germail, 2 wise men. So they come, and every night Zahak kills two boys and eats their brain. All right, it feeds the brains to the snakes. But what they do is that every night they kill one boy and mix the brain of that boy with sheep's. So you know the story. So what Bahram Beyzaie does in the first part of this says that it was actually Shahnaz and Arnavaz who set up the whole plot. And it makes sense, all right? Whether you accept it or not, it makes sense. It depends. It is one of the ways that you can see the story. But because it is epic, men were celebrated. And the wise men who were the ones who saved it. So he compares this with the story of 1001 Night in which we have Shahrzad and Dinazad together civilizing Shahriyar. So Shahriyar has been betrayed by his wife. He's very upset. He was a good king, but he's very upset. Every night he marries a woman and he kills her in the morning. So the land is being deprived of the possibility of continuity. Shahrzad volunteers, and together they trick the king, and during a period of 3 years, they transform him. So Bahram Beyzaie pays attention to that, and he, in a way, creates a discourse about the story of Zahak and Shahnaz and Arnavaz being the original story of 1001 Night. Right? This is what he does. In the second part, he focuses on the story of the translation of Hezar Afsan, the original 1001, into Arabic. All right? Again, it depends. It's an imaginary situation in which somebody translated, and then in the process, the actual book is thrown into a bucket. The story of a book being placed in a bucket actually is real. It has been reported by Edward Brown. It actually happened because they said it is dirty. So whatever we want is in the Quran, so whatever, we put it. So it actually happened. Bahram Beyzaie uses it in this second part, in which the translator is killed, and then the book is destroyed, but the book becomes 1001 Night. And the two sisters, and the wife and the sister of the translator also commit ritual sacrifice in order to avoid being raped by the Arabs, by the Arabs invaders. In the third story, what happens is that we have, it is early 20th century or late 19th century, the book has been translated, but the clergy have claimed that any woman who reads this book will die, all right? So we have the game of two sisters transforming the thug that is married to one of them into a good guy. So again, the dragon king or a powerful man is transformed by two women. I don't give you the details because you have to read it in Persian or English, you decide. But that is what he does. That is why this is called the 1001st night, because it is the night before the 1001 night. In the story of Zahak, he rules Iran for 1,000 years, all right? But Bahram Beyzaie interestingly says that it was actually 1,000 days, but it felt like 1,000 years, which makes sense because a lot of people got killed. So it is the night before Zahak's death. So the 1001st night, okay? So read it.
You mentioned trauma before Bahram Beyzaie, and you also mentioned that he was from a Baha'i family. I'm curious if you want to say more about that impact.
Yeah. So many of the things that have happened in the history of Iran has had to do a bit about the animosity of the clergy with Baha'i people. Okay, that has played a significant. Few people know that, but I think one of the reasons why people like Kashani turned their back to Mossadegh was because they asked him to control the Baha'is and limit them and even punish them. But Mossadegh said, no, these are people of Iran. It doesn't make any difference, right? So they turned their back. This was one of the reasons why the clergy went against Mossadegh. Prior to that, they supported him, all right? So this story is very simple. Beyzaie has never been religious. He loves the mythology of religions because they are beautiful. But as a young person evolving, he never became religious. But in any case, he had learned a lot from his family. And his family had brought, remember that Baha'ism is a religious reform movement. It has significant positive things in it. It's just like many of the reform movements that we have had in Iran, and they created new discourses, all right? So Bahram Beyzaie has learned from that, definitely. It is like, for instance, many of us growing up Shia learned positive things about Shiism, and later we realized that it also has terrible things. But prior to that, we learned, for instance, the idea of protecting the poor, all right? Or the idea of, I don't want to get into details, but for instance, the image of Muhammad that we heard before the Islamic Republic was the image of forgiveness, kindness, gentility, or Ali the same. But later we realized that suddenly Khomeini started talking about beheading 700 people or kill. So these discourses are always in the air. In the case of Bahaism, Beyzaie didn't practice it, but he was accused of using or promoting Bahaism. So a great example is the story of Qaribeh Stranger and Folk, for which he was claimed that you are giving us a circular history. Circular history is Baha'i. It is not. Circular history is agricultural mythology because the land dies and is revived. And even Shiism is circular because Mahdi, when he's born, he's killed. So we have a circle. But you know, when they look at one perspective of religion and they blame the other. So Bahaism is a part of Iranian discourse, and a major part, because it played an important role in the 19th and early 20th century changes. So Beyzaie using elements from that is normal. But it doesn't mean that he's promoting it. What he does is that he goes back to the origin of everything that we have in the culture and establishes a discourse with them because he's secular. Okay? So did I say, or do you want more? I can't say more. It's a lot. Yeah.
Can I say something about this? I mean, as a minority, to see the society from outside.
Yeah.
It's much better for you to see the dynamics of the society. And as a Baha'i, Beyzaie was from outside of the norm, so you could see the dynamics of how everything worked. I think that was, and that's why we have so many strangers in Qaribeh, in Bashu, and he has this person who doesn't belong anywhere, and he looks at everything from outside and inside. I think it's true about women, and that's why women can see what's happening in the society because they're not part of the whole patriarchy. So I think that really gives Mr. Beyzaie a real power to analyze its own society.
You know, what Sapide is saying is the door example that I gave you.
Yeah.
So when the door doesn't open, you pay attention and you see it. And then Beyzaie evolved with this idea of knowing his culture from outside. I call it outsider gaze. So he has this outsider gaze. And remember that outsider gaze is something that we all can achieve. But for a person like Beyzaie, the bases were always there because of the trauma that he had suffered. Yeah.
Can I say something again about the hero? You mentioned goddesses and heroes. None of those goddesses and heroes are good people. And they're very complicated. Like, I hate Rostam. He always tricks, he always does bad things, and he's our hero. So the thing is that making the lady that asked about the hero making women heroes, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. It's a complicated thing.
Yeah, figure.
So it's just, I think what you meant is like they have lots of agency and power, but not necessarily good.
You know, anybody who does something makes mistake. That's the problem. Right, all right. If you stand aside and sit down, you don't make mistake. If Bahram Beyzaie had not written 120 plays and screenplays, nobody could have criticized him. He does that, and then people criticize and also learn a lot from him. So a hero is a person who engages in doing things, whatever we call that person, all right? A citizen is somebody who wants to contribute to society. But as I said, the greatest thinkers of time usually have come from traumas, all right? But a trauma that has been sublimated, has been turned into something greater by experience and by creativity.
And I think part of the problem is that we talk about heroism. I think Beyzaie's major critique of Iranian history is not about heroes. It's about messianism. It's about the idea of the Mahdi. It's about Arash as a Mahdi. He has no problem with heroes. He has a problem to think that society thinks these heroes are the messiahs. Yes. The age of messianism has ended in Beyzaie. I think that's one of the most remarkable things.
I completely agree. In that book, I have written about Arash. And in that, exactly, I highlight that point. We have, in that story, we have somebody called Kashvat. Kashvat is the son of Craved, the proletarian hero. And he keeps telling Arash, don't do that. Don't sacrifice yourself. Don't shoot the arrow. Because if you do that, they will always wait for another person to come and save them. But Arash has to do it because he has been betrayed by his own people and has been betrayed and has been ridiculed by the enemy. In a way, he wants to end his life. He's fed up. Beyzaie shows that what he's doing is useless, but at the same time, he shows that it is suffering that has turned him into what he is. He has to do that. So what Professor Meilani was saying is one of the significant things about Beyzaie. The messianism, the idea of a savior will come and save us, is essential. Even in Pahlawan Akbar, we have it. In Pahlawan Akbar, Akbar is fed up with the whole idea of doing everything for people who don't want to do anything for themselves. Nothing. And that is why he allows the black-wearing man to kill him. All right? So we do know that, I don't want to compare, but something similar happened to Takhti. People expected so much from him that he had become desperate completely. We don't know what finally happened to him, but it's very likely that it was suicide. So he was completely fed up. In Pahlawan Akbar, we don't know what happens. It is a Jungian shadow tracing him, going around him, the black-wearing figure. All right? But ultimately, Akbar doesn't want to defend himself, and that is why the black-wearing man comes and stabs him from behind. He's fed up with whatever has happened. Even in that play, Pahlawan Akbar, his closest friend is a Zoroastrian wine seller who has suffered under the clergy and under the government because his whole district has been destroyed. So I completely agree. So it is the idea of heroes are not needed. We are the ones who have to become citizens.
So the idea of woman as a savior is dead then? We agree on that.
The woman as the savior, no.
It's not like that.
No. I know what you mean. So it has two aspects. One, of course, obviously in the case of mad dog, killing mad dogs, it happens. Woman as the savior cannot save anybody but herself and contributing to society by creativity. That is what she has to do. But the idea is that creating a role model and giving society something that has been missing is significant. So you call it a heroine? Or
that's a very religious, moralist idea, and I feel like Bahram Beyzaie was actually against it. He tried to modernize that. He tried to actually revitalize mythology in a completely humanized, modernized way. But the way you are presenting this, I feel like it still goes through just displacing that old mythology instead of modernized, like keeping that modernization in it, which is actually the death of hero.
Death of the hero, like is
the imminent idea of human, right?
So the question.
So say something about, I just think that one thing is very important in Mr. Beyzaie's, to me, books is the rebirth is the fertility and rebirth. I think Mr. Beyzaie always in his talks and everything talks about the society that's not leading our society in Iran. And he's very much working so hard to revitalize our society. And so is fertility. And you should look at I think you should look at Mr. Beyzaie's books like Modern Mythologies or Mythology or whatever we missed in mythology, like Arash or Imam Yazdigird, the death of Yazdigird was only one sentence in the history, but he takes it and he revitalized this. So I think what you really, I think what you are saying, that he's looking at fertility and revitalizing, and he sees women, and because as we talked, he's also an outsider as a Baha'i. Us women are outsider of the society. He chooses women as the people who are going to give rebirth to this dead society, for the dead society that was invaded, and that is revitalizing us. We need this revitalization. He tells us to read Shahnameh, to do this, to do that, to do all this homework.
So I think we can finish the conversation first with maybe just one or two more questions for our professor, and we can continue this after.
So we can continue discussing that. But one point that I want to say, very quick one. Demythologizing a culture. Beyzaie believes that myth is not leaving us. It's always going to be here, always around, and we are affected by it. So the ideal thing is to reread and reformulate it so that it becomes modern, all right? Depending on how you look at it, whatever you do, heroes and heroines are going to be around, all right? And that doesn't mean that they are heroes in the old sense of the term. They are going to change and not become messianic, just become a part of the culture like all of us. Remember, in Beyzaie, Arash becomes a hero. He's not born a hero. What does that, no, let me finish this. What does that tell you? It means that we can all become heroes. We don't need to be born heroes. And heroes does not mean a savior. Heroes means somebody who does whatever he can or she can to contribute to society. And then he also creates role models for women to do that. I don't think that demythologizing means saying no to myth. It means reformulating it for modern culture, and it involves making citizens. Yeah. Yes.
You know, when I read first of all, thank you so much for wonderful speech. And when I read the book, like focusing on the women, like the book, all the books that Mr. Beyzaie wrote, or the movies or the plays, I always imagine that they are telling us that femininity, energy, all of us is missing. Mm-hmm. And the women in these stories is breaking up the female energy in the men that are missing. So it's not men or women, it's just and that's quite representative of water and earth. Yeah. So for me, it's like that. I don't know it's right or wrong. But it's not about the gender, it's about that energy of the femininity has been missed, and we have to invoke that.
Yes, at the center of all his works, there is this dream of prosperity and trying to contribute to culture with male and female agency. So I agree with that point, yes. Yeah. It becomes very complicated when you get to details, but there is a general perspective.
Yes. But the whole point of the misery in our life is that female energy has been missed, and we are focusing on the masculinity of our energy.
Thank you very much.